The Vanishing Patient. It was a typical night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, a mid-sized medical facility in a quiet town. The staff on duty were accustomed to the slow, almost eerie calm that settled over the wards after dark. Nurses moved through the dimly lit hallways, their footsteps muffled by the polished floors, and the occasional murmur of a patient in their sleep was the only sound that broke the silence. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, an elderly woman was brought into the emergency room. She was frail, with thin, white hair framing a face lined with age and pain. Her breathing was labored, each inhale rattling ominously in her chest. The attending physician quickly diagnosed her with a severe case of pneumonia. Her family, a middle-aged son and daughter-in-law, hovered nearby, worry etched on their faces. They had found her unresponsive in her home and rushed her to the hospital, fearing the worst. The doctors and nurses worked swiftly, administering antibiotics and oxygen to stabilize her. The woman's condition was critical, but after a few tense hours, her vitals began to improve. It was a surprising turnaround, almost too surprising. By midnight, the woman was sitting up in bed, a faint smile playing on her lips. She even asked for a glass of water, her voice weak but clear. The staff exchanged puzzled glances but were relieved nonetheless. The doctor on duty made a note to follow up with her in the morning. As the night wore on, the hospital settled into its usual rhythm. The woman, who had been the center of attention just hours before, now seemed like any other patient. The nurses on duty checked in on her periodically, noting her continued improvement. Around 3 a.m., the charge nurse made her final rounds before the shift change. When she reached the woman's room, she found the bed empty. Assuming the woman had been moved to another ward for further treatment, the nurse checked the transfer logs. There was no record of her being moved. Puzzled, she checked the hospital's electronic system, but there was no trace of the woman's file. Growing increasingly concerned, she alerted the doctor, who immediately began a search of the hospital. Every corner was checked, every room searched, but the elderly woman had vanished without a trace. The staff was baffled. Security was called, and they reviewed the footage from the hospital's cameras. The footage showed the woman's family bringing her into the hospital and the medical team treating her, but after she was admitted to the ward, the cameras revealed nothing. There was no footage of her leaving her room, no record of her being wheeled out, nothing. Morning came, and with it, the woman's son and daughter-in-law returned to the hospital, expecting to find their mother recovering. When they were told that she was missing, they were shocked. The hospital launched an investigation, but it yielded no answers. The family, desperate for closure, asked the hospital staff if they could speak to someone who had last seen her. But even when they spoke to the doctor and nurses who had treated her, it was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and the woman's disappearance became a local legend. Some of the hospital staff began to whisper that the woman hadn't been a patient at all, that she was a spirit, lost between worlds, who had found a moment of peace before moving on. Others speculated that she had been a figment of collective imagination, brought on by the stress and exhaustion of working in a hospital. But those who had seen her, those who had touched her cold skin and heard her labored breathing, knew that she had been real. Her family, heartbroken and confused, never stopped searching for answers. They hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and even reached out to local authorities, but no trace of the woman was ever found. The room where she had stayed remained empty for weeks afterward, as if the hospital itself was reluctant to admit another patient into a space that had become tainted by her disappearance. To this day, the mystery of the vanishing patient haunts the staff at St. Mary's Hospital. Some say that on quiet nights, when the hospital is still, they can hear the faint sound of labored breathing echoing through the halls, a reminder of the patient who came in from the cold and disappeared without a trace. The Empty Nursery. The rural hospital where Sarah worked was small, with a tight-knit staff that had seen each other through countless long shifts and emergencies. The maternity ward was particularly close, a place of joy and new beginnings, where the cries of newborns filled the halls with life. But there was one night in the mid-1990s that changed everything, casting a shadow over the ward that would never fully lift. It was a quiet evening, with only a few mothers and their babies occupying the ward. The nursery, where the newborns were kept when their mothers needed rest, was empty for the first time in weeks. Sarah, a veteran nurse with over 2 decades of experience, was doing her rounds when she noticed something strange. The door to the nursery, usually closed and locked, was slightly ajar. A soft, flickering light spilled out into the hallway, casting long, eerie shadows. Sarah frowned. She was certain she had turned off the lights and locked the door after the last baby had been returned to its mother. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, only to be greeted by an unsettling silence. The cribs were empty, just as they should have been. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the distant cry of a baby. She froze, listening intently. The cry grew louder, more distinct, but when she turned on the lights, the room was exactly as it should be, empty. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving Sarah with an uneasy feeling that crawled up her spine. She checked every corner of the room, every crib, but there was no baby to be found. Over the next few nights, the crying became more frequent. It was always the same, starting as a soft whimper and growing into a full-throated wail before abruptly stopping. The other nurses heard it too, and soon, the entire maternity ward was buzzing with talk of the phantom cries. Some of the younger nurses dismissed it as nerves or the wind playing tricks, but Sarah knew better. There was something deeply wrong in that nursery. Unable to shake her growing unease, Sarah began to investigate. She spoke to some of the older staff members, those who had worked at the hospital long before she arrived. What she learned left her shaken. Decades earlier, a fire had swept through that very wing of the hospital. It had started in the nursery, and before anyone could respond, the flames had engulfed the entire room. Several newborns perished in the blaze, their lives cut tragically short before they had even begun. The nursery had been rebuilt on the same spot, its tragic history buried beneath layers of fresh paint and new equipment. But some wounds never heal, and it seemed that the spirits of those lost infants were still trapped there, their cries for help echoing through the years. Sarah's discovery weighed heavily on her, and though she continued to work in the ward, she could never again enter the nursery without feeling a chill in the air. The crying eventually subsided, but the staff remained uneasy, especially at night. To this day, the nursery is a place where few dare to linger, a silent reminder of the tragedy that had once unfolded there. The Silent Watcher. In the sprawling psychiatric ward of a large urban hospital, night shifts were always unsettling. The building itself, a relic from the early 20th century, was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, peeling wallpaper, and dimly lit rooms. The patients, some suffering from severe mental illnesses, often added to the ward's eerie atmosphere with their midnight ramblings and unpredictable behavior. But in the winter of 2015, something happened that made even the most hardened nurses question their sanity. A young woman, no older than 23, was brought in late one night. She had been found wandering the streets, disheveled and barefoot, muttering incoherently to herself. When the police picked her up, she offered no resistance, but she also gave no information about who she was or where she came from. She carried nothing but a small, tattered journal clutched tightly in her hands. The hospital staff quickly realized that this was no ordinary case. The woman was completely unresponsive to any attempts at communication. She didn't speak, didn't react, didn't even seem to acknowledge the presence of others. Her only action was to occasionally open the journal and trace the pages with her fingers, as if searching for something that only she could see. The journal itself was filled with nonsensical scribbles, symbols, and words that made no sense. The doctors were baffled, unable to diagnose her condition. She wasn't catatonic in the traditional sense, she could move and was aware of her surroundings, but she existed in a state of complete detachment, as though her mind was elsewhere. They decided to keep her under observation, hoping that time would reveal the nature of her condition. The night staff, however, began to notice something strange. Whenever they entered her room, they felt an overwhelming sense of unease, a cold, heavy presence that seemed to lurk just out of sight. The room itself was always colder than the rest of the ward, no matter how high they turned up the heat. The nurses started to avoid her room unless absolutely necessary, dreading the sense of dread that seemed to cling to the air. One night, a nurse named Anna was making her rounds. She had been a part of the hospital staff for years and prided herself on her professionalism. But as she approached the young woman's room, she felt a chill run down her spine. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see the woman sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at something on the far side of the room. Anna hesitated, but she couldn't ignore her duty. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The woman's gaze didn't shift, she continued to stare at the empty corner of the room, her eyes fixed and unblinking. Anna followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint outline of an old chair. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and Anna felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned to leave, her instincts screaming at her to get out, but something made her glance back at the window. Reflected in the glass, she saw a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette standing at the foot of the woman's bed. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. Anna's breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, but the figure was gone. The young woman, however, had shifted. She was now staring directly at Anna, a faint smile curling at the corners of her mouth. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a smile that chilled Anna to the bone. Terrified, Anna backed out of the room and ran to get help. When she returned with another nurse and a doctor, the room was as it had always been, cold and empty, with the young woman lying silently in bed. The doctor, skeptical of Anna's claims, chalked it up to exhaustion, but Anna knew what she had seen. The shadowy figure, the glowing eyes, it wasn't a figment of her imagination. The following morning, the young woman was gone. Her bed was neatly made, and her journal was missing. The hospital staff searched the entire ward, but she had vanished without a trace. The security footage showed no one entering or leaving her room during the night. The only thing the cameras had captured was a brief flicker of static, and then nothing. The incident left the staff shaken. Some believed the young woman had been a victim of something paranormal, something beyond their understanding. Others refused to talk about it, pretending that nothing had happened. But those who had been there that night couldn't forget the cold, the silence, and the feeling of being watched by something unseen, something that might still be lurking in the shadows of the old psychiatric ward.